The cold bit at Sarah's skin as she huddled in the thin jacket she had found at a charity shop months ago. Winter had settled deep in the bones of the town, and with it, a sense of hopelessness that hung over the streets like a fog. The small, forgotten town hadn't offered Sarah much in the last few years. Just closed doors, empty promises, and a fading hope that things might get better. Her son, Tommy, coughed beside her, a dry, raspy sound that echoed the deep pain she carried inside. He had been sick for weeks now, and despite her best efforts, Sarah couldn't afford the medicine he needed. She had begged at the clinic, asked for help from neighbors, but everyone was just as strapped for resources as she was. They were surviving, barely, and no one had room for charity. Sarah looked down at Tommy. His face was pale, the spark in his brown eyes dimmed with fever. She pulled him closer, rubbing his back to try to ease his discomfort, but her hands trembled with cold. They had nowhere to go tonight, and the wind was picking up, whistling through the narrow streets. She had hoped to find shelter at the community center, but when she arrived, they told her it was full. There was no space for a mother and her sick child. Her stomach clenched with hunger, and her mind raced for options. The last of her savings had gone toward food 2 days ago, and now she had nothing left. She had searched every corner of town for work, any work, but there were no jobs. Factories had closed, shops had shuttered their doors, and people were leaving. Moving to places with better prospects, places where they weren't constantly haunted by the ghosts of what the town used to be. But Sarah couldn't leave. Tommy was too sick to travel, and besides, where would they go? She had no family, no friends outside of this place. All she had was the desperate hope that something would change, that maybe, just maybe, tomorrow would bring an opportunity she hadn't yet seen. As they passed another row of closed shops, the streetlights flickered overhead. Sarah saw a house at the end of the street, an old, decaying place she had passed before but never paid much attention to. It was large, looming in the distance, its windows dark and its paint peeling. She hesitated, something about the place feeling off, but her exhaustion was too great. Maybe the person inside could offer them some shelter, even just for one night. She glanced at Tommy, his small face pressed against her chest. She had to try. With a deep breath, Sarah approached the front door of the crumbling house and knocked, the sound echoing in the stillness of the night. The door creaked open, revealing a frail old man with a hunchback. He peered at her through the narrow crack, his eyes sharp but guarded. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and Sarah felt the weight of her own desperation pressing down on her chest. I'm sorry to bother you, Sarah began, her voice trembling from the cold and fear of rejection. My son is sick. We have nowhere to go tonight. Do you know of any place we could find shelter? The man's gaze shifted to Tommy, who was nestled in her arms, his tiny body racked with another fit of coughing. A flicker of something, compassion, perhaps, crossed the man's face, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. He opened the door a little wider, revealing more of himself. His clothes were worn and simple, and the house behind him seemed as tired as he was, dusty, filled with the scent of time and neglect. There's no place for people like us in this town anymore, the man said, his voice rough but not unkind. But you can stay here for the night. I don't have much, but it's better than the street. Sarah exhaled, a wave of relief washing over her, though her weariness didn't fade completely. Thank you, she whispered, stepping inside the house. The warmth, though faint, was a welcome change from the biting cold outside. The man led them to a small room on the ground floor, where a dusty couch sat near a low-burning fire. You can sleep here, he said, nodding toward the couch. It's not much, but it'll keep you warm. Sarah placed Tommy gently on the couch, brushing his damp hair back from his forehead. She turned to the man, unsure of how to express her gratitude. I don't know how to thank you. There's no need, the man replied, his eyes distant as though he was speaking more to himself than to her. I'm Henry. You can stay as long as you need, but I'll expect some help around the house in return. Sarah nodded quickly. Of course. I'll do anything you need. Henry didn't say anything more, but he lingered in the doorway for a moment, his eyes flicking between Sarah and Tommy as if debating whether to speak again. Finally, he muttered, Get some rest. before disappearing into the shadows of the hallway. Sarah sat down beside Tommy, pulling the thin blanket from the back of the couch over both of them. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, but the room still felt cold, filled with a heaviness that she couldn't quite place. As Tommy's breathing slowed into a fitful sleep, Sarah's mind raced with questions about this strange man and the house they now found themselves in. But for now, she was too tired to think. Tomorrow, she promised herself she would figure things out. Tomorrow, she would find a way to make it through another day. The morning light barely seeped through the cracked, heavy curtains of Henry's house. Sarah woke with a stiff back, her body curled on the dusty couch beside Tommy. His fever had broken slightly during the night, and his breathing, while shallow, had softened. Relief tugged at her, but the question of what to do next weighed heavily on her mind. Henry was nowhere to be seen, but she could hear the faint creaking of floorboards deeper inside the house. She gently rose, careful not to wake Tommy, and walked toward the kitchen, where the sounds of movement were coming from. The house felt ancient. Each step she took sent a low groan through the floor, and the air was heavy with the smell of neglect, dust, and something more difficult to place. When she entered the kitchen, she found Henry at the stove, stirring something in a pot. The room was as old and worn as the rest of the house, the walls stained with years of grime and time. Henry looked up briefly when she entered, but said nothing. Sarah hesitated. I wanted to thank you again for letting us stay. I know you didn't have to. Henry kept his focus on the pot. There's no need for thanks. Just keep your word and help around the house. I will, she said quickly. Whatever you need, I'll do it. A long silence stretched between them, broken only by the bubbling sound from the pot. After a moment, Henry spoke again, his voice quiet but firm. This house, it hasn't been cared for in a long time. I can't do much anymore. My legs don't work like they used to. There are rooms that need cleaning, things that need fixing. You'll stay as long as you help. Sarah nodded, grateful for the offer despite the strangeness of it all. Of course, I'll start today. Henry stirred the pot slowly, as though thinking over his next words carefully. There are a few rooms upstairs that are off limits. Don't touch them. Everything else you can do as you please. Sarah felt a flicker of suspicion, but pushed it down. She wasn't in a position to ask questions, not when Tommy needed a safe place. Understood, she said, keeping her tone respectful. I won't go near them. Henry glanced at her, his eyes dark and unreadable, before turning back to his task. Good. Later that day, after feeding Tommy some broth Henry had made, Sarah began her work. She moved carefully through the house, wiping down surfaces, sweeping away layers of dust that had accumulated over the years. It was clear the house had been abandoned long before Henry had closed himself off from the world. The furniture was old, some of it covered in sheets, and every room seemed to carry the weight of forgotten memories. As she worked, Sarah's mind wandered back to Henry's warnings. Why were there rooms she wasn't allowed to enter? What was he hiding? She tried to suppress her curiosity, knowing it wouldn't do her any good to pry. Still, the questions gnawed at her. Hours passed as she cleaned, and she found herself slowly uncovering pieces of Henry's past, though none of them provided clear answers. There were pictures on the walls, old family photos of a young girl with bright eyes, standing next to a smiling couple. Henry's face, younger but unmistakable, was there. But where was his family now? Why was he living alone in this decaying house? The silence of the house was unsettling, broken only by the occasional sound of Henry's footsteps, slow and deliberate. He seemed to move around her like a ghost, appearing in doorways only to vanish moments later without a word. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to this place, something heavy with secrets. As the day wore on and she neared one of the upstairs hallways, Sarah noticed a door that had been locked with a heavy bolt. This must be one of the off-limits rooms Henry had mentioned. She stood there for a moment, staring at the door, the weight of her curiosity growing stronger. But she shook her head and turned away. There was no point in risking the only shelter they had, not when Tommy needed her to be smart. Over the next few days, Sarah fell into a routine. She spent her mornings caring for Tommy, who had grown a little stronger but was still too weak to leave the house. In the afternoons, she cleaned, scrubbed, and swept every inch of the house that she was allowed to touch. All the while, Henry remained distant, drifting through the house like a shadow. Despite the arrangement, Sarah could sense the tension in the air. Henry rarely spoke, but when he did, his words were clipped, as though he was forcing himself to maintain some sense of order in his life. There were times when she caught him staring out the window, his face tight with emotion she couldn't decipher. On one such day, as she was polishing the mantel in the living room, she gathered the courage to ask him a question. "The girl in the photos, was she your daughter?" Henry's back stiffened, and for a long moment, he didn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, gravelly whisper. "Yes." Sarah could tell from his tone that it was a painful subject, but her curiosity was too strong. "What happened to her?" Henry turned to look at her, his eyes dark and filled with something she couldn't quite place. Guilt, sorrow, maybe even anger. "That's none of your concern," he said harshly, and Sarah immediately regretted asking. She lowered her head, focusing on her work again. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. Just do your job." Henry interrupted, his voice tight. Sarah said nothing more. The room fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the soft sound of her polishing cloth moving across the wood. But something had shifted between them. She could feel it. Henry had built a wall around himself, and Sarah had just found the first crack. That night, long after Henry had disappeared into his private quarters, Sarah sat on the couch with Tommy, her mind racing. There was something dark in Henry's past, something that was keeping him trapped in this house just as much as it was keeping her there. And she wasn't sure if it was fear or guilt that held him captive. For now, all she could do was keep her head down and keep working. But deep down, Sarah knew that whatever was haunting Henry wouldn't stay hidden forever. The following morning, a sense of dread settled over Sarah as Tommy's cough returned with a vengeance. He was pale, beads of sweat glistening on his forehead as his tiny body trembled under the thin blanket. The broth Henry had made was no longer enough to sustain him, and each wheezing breath he took felt like a dagger in her chest. Sarah sat on the edge of the couch, gently wiping his forehead with a damp cloth, her mind racing for solutions. She knew she had to act quickly. Tommy needed proper medical attention, but she had no money and no means of getting him to a hospital. Her situation had grown increasingly desperate. Henry, as usual, stayed mostly out of sight, drifting silently around the house. Sarah tried to focus on her duties, scrubbing the floors and dusting the furniture. But every time Tommy coughed, her heart clenched. She couldn't continue pretending that things were fine, not when her son's life hung in the balance. By midday, Sarah couldn't take it anymore. She found Henry sitting in a small study near the back of the house, his eyes fixed on an old book. She hesitated at the doorway before speaking, unsure of how to broach the subject. "Henry," she began, her voice shaky but determined. "I need help." He looked up slowly, his brow furrowing in concern. "What is it?" "It's Tommy," Sarah said, stepping into the room. "He's getting worse. The medicine you gave me helped for a while, but it's not enough anymore. I don't know what to do." Henry's expression darkened, and for a moment he seemed lost in thought. Finally, he sighed and set the book aside. "I told you before, I don't have much left. I've given you all the medicine I had." Sarah's heart sank. "Please, there has to be something. I can't just sit here and watch him suffer." Henry's eyes flickered with something. Regret, maybe, but he didn't move from his chair. "The town is dying, Sarah. There's no one left to help. The clinics have closed, the doctors have moved on. You won't find what you need here." Sarah clenched her fists, frustration boiling beneath her skin. She understood that the town was in shambles, but hearing Henry say it out loud only deepened her sense of helplessness. "So, what do I do? Just wait for him to die?" Henry flinched at her words, and for the first time, Sarah saw a crack in his stoic demeanor. "I'm sorry," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's nothing more I can offer you." Tears of anger and desperation filled Sarah's eyes. She turned away from him, her heart pounding in her chest. Tommy's life was slipping through her fingers, and she had no one to turn to. She stormed back to the living room, where Tommy lay shivering under the blankets. Sarah knelt beside him, brushing a strand of hair from his fevered brow. "I'll figure something out," she whispered, though the words felt hollow. "I promise." But as the hours passed, the weight of that promise grew heavier, and Sarah's mind spiraled into panic. She needed to act, and soon, or she would lose the most precious thing in her life. Night fell, and Sarah remained by Tommy's side, her thoughts filled with dread. Each shallow breath he took seemed like a countdown, and with every passing minute, Sarah's helplessness grew. She barely noticed when Henry appeared in the doorway, his face shadowed by the dim light from the hall. "I heard him coughing," Henry said, his voice low. There was no anger, no irritation, just a quiet resignation. Sarah didn't respond. She had nothing left to say. Henry stood in the doorway for a long moment before he stepped into the room, his movements slow and careful. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, glass vial, something Sarah hadn't seen before. This is all I have left," he muttered, holding out the vial to her. "It's an old remedy. I don't know if it will work, but it's worth a try." Sarah's eyes widened in surprise. "What is it?" "Something my wife used to keep for our daughter when she got sick," Henry said, his voice tinged with pain. "It's strong. It might help bring down his fever." Without hesitation, Sarah took the vial from his hand. She could see the reluctance in his eyes. This vial held something more than medicine. It held a piece of his past, something he had likely kept for years. Yet he was offering it to her. She uncorked the bottle and gently tilted it toward Tommy's lips, letting a few drops of the liquid fall into his mouth. He stirred, his body twitching at the bitter taste, but after a moment, his breathing seemed to ease, if only a little. Sarah looked up at Henry, her gratitude overwhelming. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't know how to—" "Don't," Henry interrupted, his voice rough. He turned away, retreating toward the shadows once more. "Just get some rest." Sarah watched him leave, her mind racing with questions she didn't dare ask. Henry had been cold and distant since the moment they arrived. Yet now, in her darkest hour, he had shown a glimpse of humanity. He had given her a piece of himself, even though it clearly caused him pain. As the night wore on, Sarah remained awake, watching over Tommy as his fever gradually began to break. His breathing, though still shallow, had steadied. For the first time in days, hope flickered in her chest, faint but present. But even as she clung to that hope, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that Henry's kindness came at a cost. There was a story buried deep in this house, a story that Henry was desperate to keep hidden, and she wasn't sure how long he could keep it locked away. For now, though, all she could do was wait. Tommy's condition had improved, and that was enough. Tomorrow, she would figure out her next steps. Tomorrow, she would decide what to do. But as Sarah sat in the quiet room, with only the soft crackle of the fire and Tommy's steady breathing to accompany her, she couldn't help but wonder how much longer Henry would be able to keep his secrets hidden. The days passed slowly, and though Tommy's fever had lessened, his energy remained low. Sarah continued to work in Henry's house, trying to keep herself focused on her tasks. She found solace in keeping busy, scrubbing the floors, dusting the old shelves, and occasionally finding small remnants of a life once lived in this decaying place. Every time she passed one of the locked rooms, curiosity tugged at her. Henry's instructions to avoid those rooms had been clear, but the mystery gnawed at her. One afternoon, while Henry was out in the garden, Sarah found herself in the upstairs hallway, standing before one of the forbidden doors. She stared at the heavy lock, her hand hovering over the cold doorknob. Something about this door in particular seemed different from the others. It wasn't just the lock. It was the sense of loss that seemed to radiate from behind it. Sarah glanced down the hall to make sure Henry wasn't nearby. Her heart raced as she reached in her pocket and pulled out a small hairpin she had found on one of her cleaning ventures. She knew she shouldn't, but the need to know what Henry was hiding had become too strong. She carefully inserted the pin into the lock, her fingers trembling slightly as she worked. After a few moments of fumbling, there was a soft click and the lock gave way. Sarah swallowed hard and slowly pushed the door open, her breath catching as the hinges creaked in protest. The room inside was dim, the heavy curtains drawn tightly against the light. Dust motes floated lazily through the air, and Sarah felt a sudden chill as she stepped inside. Her eyes scanned the room, and what she saw made her heart ache. It was a child's room. Everything was frozen in time, untouched by the years of neglect that had claimed the rest of the house. A small bed sat in the corner, its sheets neatly folded. A shelf full of old toys lined one wall, and on a small desk, there were school books and papers, all yellowed with age. Sarah stepped further into the room, her eyes lingering on the details. This had been a little girl's room, Henry's daughter's room, she realized. The air was thick with sadness, as if the room itself was mourning the loss of the child who had once lived here. On the desk, Sarah noticed a photograph in a dusty frame. She picked it up carefully, wiping away the grime to reveal the image beneath. It was Henry, much younger, standing beside a woman with warm eyes and a gentle smile. Between them was a little girl, her face beaming with joy. Sarah's chest tightened as she looked at the picture. This was the family that Henry had lost. As she placed the photograph back on the desk, a soft noise caught her attention. She turned toward the closet in the corner of the room. The door was ajar, and something about it drew her closer. With cautious steps, Sarah approached the closet and slowly pulled the door open. Inside, hanging neatly, were the little girl's clothes, dresses, jackets, and shoes, all perfectly preserved. On the floor of the closet was a small, dusty suitcase, and next to it, an old, worn-out doll. Sarah bent down to pick up the doll, her fingers brushing against the fabric. It had once been a cherished toy, its faded features a testament to years of love and play. A sudden rush of emotions overwhelmed her, and Sarah sank to the floor, holding the doll close to her chest. She could feel the weight of Henry's grief in this room, the way he had locked away his memories, hoping to keep the pain at bay. But the past had a way of seeping through even the strongest of barriers, and Sarah could feel it now, swirling around her like a ghost. She didn't know how long she sat there, lost in the sadness of the room. But when she finally stood, placing the doll gently back in the closet, she knew she had to leave before Henry returned. As she slipped out of the room and carefully locked the door behind her, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she had crossed a line. She had seen something deeply personal, something that Henry had buried. And now that she knew, there was no going back. That evening, Sarah sat by the fireplace, her mind heavy with what she had uncovered. Tommy lay beside her, his breathing steady as he slept. She watched the flickering flames, trying to make sense of the emotions swirling inside her. Henry had lost his daughter, and the weight of that loss was still very much alive in him, lurking in the shadows of this house. The room had been a shrine to a life long gone, and Sarah couldn't help but feel the deep grief that Henry carried with him every day. She knew she had to confront him, but the thought made her stomach churn. How could she bring it up? Would he be angry that she had invaded such a private part of his life? And yet, she couldn't pretend she hadn't seen what she had. The room, the doll, the photograph, they were too real, too significant to ignore. Henry entered the room just as Sarah was lost in thought. His presence, as always, was quiet but commanding. He walked slowly to the armchair by the fire and sat down with a heavy sigh, staring into the flames without acknowledging her. For a long while, neither of them spoke. The crackling of the fire was the only sound in the room, a comforting rhythm in the silence. Finally, Sarah couldn't take it anymore. "Henry," she began, her voice soft but firm. I found a room." The words hung in the air between them like a weight, and for a moment, she wasn't sure he had heard her. But then, his shoulders tensed, and he let out a slow, shaky breath. "I told you not to go in there," he said quietly, his voice devoid of anger, but thick with something deeper, something broken. "I'm sorry," Sarah replied quickly, her heart racing. "I didn't mean to invade your privacy, but I needed to understand." Henry remained silent, his eyes fixed on the fire. Sarah waited, the tension between them growing thicker with each passing second. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely more than a whisper. Her name was Emily. Sarah's heart clenched at the name. She could hear the pain in his voice, the rawness of it, as if saying the name aloud toward an old wound that had never healed. She was everything, Henry continued, his eyes distant, as if he were looking into a past he hadn't revisited in years. My wife and I, we couldn't have children for a long time. And then, finally, we had Emily. She was perfect. His voice cracked, and Sarah felt her throat tighten. What happened? She asked, her voice barely audible. Henry closed his eyes, his hands clenching the arms of the chair. She got sick, he whispered. We thought it was just a cold, but it wasn't. She got worse, and by the time we realized how serious it was too late. She died in that room. Sarah covered her mouth with her hand, her heart breaking for him. She had seen the room, untouched for years, frozen in time. The pain of losing a child was unimaginable, and yet Henry had lived with that pain every day, locked away in this house with his memories. I'm so sorry, Sarah whispered, unsure of what else to say. Henry didn't respond for a long while, and when he finally spoke, his voice was barely more than a whisper. I should have done more. I should have been able to save her. But I failed. His words were laced with guilt, and Sarah could see now that this was the burden he carried. The belief that he had failed his daughter, that her death was his fault. No, Sarah said, her voice stronger now. It wasn't your fault. You did everything you could. Henry shook his head, the weight of his grief too much to bear. I wasn't enough. I wasn't a good enough father. I couldn't save her. Sarah wanted to reach out, to comfort him, but she knew that his pain was too deep, too raw. All she could do was sit with him in the quiet, letting him speak the words he had kept locked away for so long. And in that moment, Sarah realized that Henry's grief wasn't just for his daughter. It was for the life he had lost, the family that had slipped through his fingers. He had locked himself away in this house, trying to forget. But the past had a way of lingering, of seeping through even the strongest walls. I don't deserve to be forgiven, Henry said softly, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. I let her down. Sarah shook her head. You did your best, Henry. You loved her, and that's what matters. The silence stretched between them again, but this time it felt different. There was no anger, no tension, only the shared understanding of loss and the slow, painful process of healing. The morning air was crisp and cold, a stark reminder of the reality Sarah and Tommy faced. Henry's confession still lingered in her mind, filling the house with an oppressive sense of sorrow, but she had little time to dwell on it. Tommy's cough had returned, harsher than before, and his weak body lay motionless on the couch, his face pale and sunken. The brief reprieve from his illness had given Sarah hope, but now it felt as though that hope was slipping away. Every time he coughed, a new wave of fear surged through Sarah. She sat by his side, wiping his forehead and whispering promises she wasn't sure she could keep. It's going to be okay, Tommy. You're going to get better. I won't let anything happen to you. But her words felt hollow, and as she stared into his fevered eyes, Sarah knew she was running out of time. She needed to get him proper medical help, something beyond the home remedies and Henry's small vial of hope. Yet, the town's resources had dried up, and she had no money, no way of getting Tommy to a doctor or hospital outside of this desolate place. Her desperation grew with each hour that passed, and she felt the weight of her own helplessness pressing down on her like a heavy blanket. She couldn't sit by and watch her son waste away. But what could she do? By late afternoon, as the sun began to set and the cold wind howled through the cracks in the old house, Sarah knew she had no choice. She had to leave. She had to get Tommy to a doctor, no matter the cost. Her decision solidified, Sarah gathered what little she had. The threadbare jacket she wore, a scarf, and a few scraps of bread left from Henry's kitchen. She bundled Tommy in blankets, wrapping him tightly to shield him from the cold. His eyes flickered open for a brief moment, weak and unfocused. Mom? Tommy's voice was barely a whisper. I'm here, baby, Sarah said, her voice shaking. I'm going to take you somewhere safe, somewhere you can get better. He gave a small nod, his eyelids heavy with exhaustion. Sarah took a deep breath, steeling herself for what lay ahead. She was about to carry her son out into the unforgiving cold, knowing that the journey ahead would be long and dangerous. But she had no other choice. As she lifted Tommy into her arms, Henry appeared in the doorway, his face a mask of concern. His voice was gruff, but there was something behind it, a deeper understanding. "Where do you think you're going?" Sarah tightened her hold on Tommy, her jaw set in determination. "I'm taking him to get help. I can't stay here anymore. He's getting worse." Henry's eyes darkened, and for a moment, Sarah thought he would stop her. But instead, he sighed, his shoulders sagging. "There's no doctor left in this town, Sarah. If you leave now, you might not make it back." "I have to try," Sarah replied, her voice thick with emotion. "I can't just sit here and watch him suffer." Henry took a step closer, his expression softening. "I know what it's like to feel helpless, but walking out into that storm with no plan, no supplies, it won't end well." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. "What am I supposed to do then, Henry? Wait for him to die?" Henry winced, as if the words struck him deep. He glanced at Tommy, his brow furrowed. "There might be another way," he said quietly. "There's an old doctor who lives outside of town. He's a bit of a recluse, but I've heard rumors that he still helps people. It's risky, but if you're determined to leave, I can show you where to find him." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "Where?" Henry crossed the room and opened a drawer, pulling out a faded map. He laid it on the table, pointing to a small, isolated cabin on the outskirts of the town. "It's a few hours' walk from here, through the forest. It's not safe, especially with the weather as it is, but if you move quickly, you might reach him before nightfall." Sarah stared at the map, her pulse quickening. It was a long shot, but it was better than wandering aimlessly with Tommy in her arms. She nodded, her decision made. "Thank you, Henry." Henry's eyes met hers, and for the first time, there was no distance between them, only a shared understanding of the desperate lengths a parent would go to for their child. "Be careful," he said softly. Sarah nodded, her voice barely audible. "I will." With the map tucked into her pocket, Sarah prepared to leave. She bundled Tommy in as many layers as she could find, wrapping him in blankets to protect him from the biting cold. Every moment that passed was a reminder of how fragile his life had become. His shallow breathing and pale complexion sent a shiver down her spine. As she reached for the front door, ready to step out into the bitter wind, something shifted behind her. A presence. Before she could turn around, the heavy thud of the door locking echoed through the house. Sarah froze, her heart leaping into her throat. Slowly, she turned, her eyes widening as she saw Henry standing by the hallway, his hand on the lock. His face was ashen, his expression filled with something she hadn't expected, fear. "What are you doing?" Sarah's voice shook, panic rising in her chest. "You can't leave," Henry said, his voice low but trembling. "Not like this. You'll die out there. You and Tommy both." Sarah stared at him, disbelief crashing through her like a tidal wave. "I have to leave, Henry. He's dying, and I can't just sit here and watch him waste away. You said yourself, there's a doctor." "I know what I said." Henry's voice cracked, and he ran a hand through his thinning hair, his eyes wild with desperation. "But I can't let you go. Not after everything." Sarah took a step forward, her pulse racing. "What are you talking about?" Henry's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles white. "I couldn't save her," he whispered, his voice breaking. "My Emily. I couldn't save her. And if you leave now, I'll lose you too. I'll lose you both." Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she realized the truth. Henry wasn't just trying to protect them from the storm. He was trying to protect himself from his own guilt, from the pain of losing another family. His fear had trapped him in this house, and now it was trapping her and Tommy too. "Henry," Sarah said, her voice soft but firm, "I'm not your daughter. And Tommy isn't her either. But I can't stay here. If I don't leave now, I'll lose him." Tears welled up in Henry's eyes, and for a moment, Sarah saw the full weight of his grief. He had built this house around his sorrow, locking away the world in an attempt to keep his pain at bay. But now, that pain was consuming him. "I'm sorry," Henry whispered, stepping away from the door. "I'm so sorry." Sarah took a deep breath, relief flooding her as she saw him slowly unlock the door. The click of the latch echoed through the room, and for a brief moment, everything was still. "I know you're scared," Sarah said, her voice trembling, "but I have to do this. I have to try." Henry nodded, his shoulders sagging under the weight of his emotions. I know. I just, I don't want to lose anyone else." With the door finally open, Sarah stepped out into the cold, Tommy cradled in her arms. The wind bit at her face, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Not now. She glanced back at Henry, who stood in the doorway, watching them disappear into the night. "I hope you find what you're looking for," Henry called after her, his voice barely audible over the howling wind. Sarah didn't answer. She didn't have the strength. Her only focus now was on reaching the doctor's cabin before it was too late. The wind cut through Sarah like a knife as she trudged through the snow-covered path. Every step felt heavier than the last, and Tommy's weight in her arms made her legs tremble. The cold air stung her face, and her breath formed clouds in front of her. Tommy's tiny body, bundled in layers, lay still against her chest. His breathing was faint, shallow, and each raspy exhale sent a jolt of fear through Sarah's heart. She had no choice but to keep moving. The map Henry had given her was clutched in her pocket, but the thick snow had erased most of the landmarks, and the forest around her was a blur of white. The towering trees provided little shelter from the biting wind, and the sky above was turning dark. She pressed Tommy closer, whispering reassurances she wasn't sure were true. "Just hold on, baby. We're almost there. Just a little further." But inside, Sarah was terrified. She wasn't sure how much longer she could carry him, how much longer she could keep moving through the storm. The cold was sinking into her bones, and her body screamed for rest. But stopping wasn't an option, not with Tommy's life hanging in the balance. Sarah's legs finally gave out as she stumbled over a snowdrift. She collapsed to her knees, Tommy still held tightly in her arms, the icy ground beneath her sending shockwaves of pain through her body. Her breath came in gasps, and the world spun around her in dizzying circles. "No," she whispered, tears burning in her eyes. "I can't stop. I can't." But as she tried to push herself to her feet, her body refused to cooperate. Her muscles were too weak, her limbs too numb from the cold. She could feel the hopelessness creeping in, the realization that she might not make it, that she might lose Tommy out here in the snow. The thought sent a shiver of dread through her. A distant sound, faint but distinct, caught her attention. A creaking, like the groan of an old wooden door. Sarah lifted her head and squinted through the swirling snow, her eyes searching for the source. Her heart leaped as she spotted a flicker of light ahead, barely visible through the storm. The cabin. Summoning every last ounce of strength, Sarah forced herself to her feet, her legs shaking beneath her. She stumbled forward, one agonizing step at a time, toward the light. Each step felt like it might be her last, but the thought of Tommy's life slipping away pushed her onward. As she neared the cabin, she could make out the shape of a figure standing in the doorway. A man, his silhouette large and imposing against the dim light inside. Sarah's breath hitched in her throat as the man stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he saw her approaching. "Help!" Sarah cried out, her voice hoarse from the cold. "Please help us!" The man hesitated for a moment, then hurried toward her, his heavy boots crunching through the snow. He reached her just as Sarah's legs gave out again, and he caught her before she fell, his strong arms wrapping around both her and Tommy. "Come inside," the man said, his voice gruff but urgent. "You'll freeze out here." Sarah barely registered his words as he carried her and Tommy inside the cabin, the warmth hitting her like a wave. She gasped as the heat surrounded her, her frozen body finally beginning to thaw. The man laid her gently on a large couch near the fire, carefully unwrapping Tommy from his blankets. Sarah's eyes fluttered open, her vision hazy, but she could see the man moving quickly, his hands checking Tommy's pulse, his breathing. Is he going to be okay?" Sarah asked weakly, her voice barely audible. The man didn't answer right away. His face was tense, focused as he worked with precision, pulling out a small vial from a nearby cabinet and administering the liquid to Tommy. Sarah's heart raced as she watched him, her fear mounting with every second that passed in silence. She was terrified, not just for Tommy, but for herself. What if this man wasn't who Henry said he was? What if she had walked into something worse? Finally, the man looked up, his expression unreadable. "He's weak, but he'll pull through," he said, his voice steady. You did the right thing bringing him here. Relief flooded through Sarah, and she let out a sob of gratitude. Thank you so much, she whispered. The man nodded but said nothing more, turning back to tend to Tommy as the fire crackled in the hearth. Hours passed, the fire's warmth seeping into Sarah's bones as she lay on the couch, drifting in and out of sleep. Tommy's breathing had stabilized, his small chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. The worst seemed to be over, but Sarah knew they weren't out of danger yet. The man, who had introduced himself as Dr. Elias, worked in silence, moving between the cabinets and the fireplace with the efficiency of someone who had done this many times before. His cabin was small but well kept, with shelves of medical supplies lining the walls and a large oak table in the center, cluttered with papers and instruments. As the night wore on, Sarah's strength slowly returned. She sat up, her muscles aching, and watched as Dr. Elias continued to monitor Tommy's condition. The doctor hadn't asked her many questions, and Sarah had been too exhausted to offer much explanation. But now, with Tommy's life no longer in immediate danger, she knew she had to ask. Thank you for saving him, Sarah said, her voice still weak but steady. I don't know how to repay you. Dr. Elias looked up from his work, his eyes cold, but not unkind. There's no need for repayment. I do what I can to help. Sarah hesitated, unsure of how to proceed. Henry, the man who sent us here, he told me about you. That you're one of the few doctors left. Dr. Elias nodded but didn't elaborate. Sarah could sense there was more to the story, but she didn't push. She was too grateful for his help to pry into his past. As dawn began to break through the cabin's windows, Sarah stood and walked over to where Tommy lay, her heart swelling with relief at the sight of his peaceful face. His fever had broken, and color was returning to his cheeks. He looked so much like himself again, and for the first time in days, Sarah felt a glimmer of hope. But as she turned to Dr. Elias, a question burned in her mind. What happens now? She asked. We can't stay here forever, and I don't know how we're going to survive once we leave. Dr. Elias regarded her carefully, his eyes narrowing slightly. You'll have to be careful, he said. The world outside this cabin isn't kind, especially to those without means. But you've proven you're resourceful. You'll find a way. Sarah nodded, though the weight of his words pressed heavily on her. She knew he was right. There was no easy path ahead, but she had come this far. She had saved Tommy's life, and that was all that mattered. Is it safe to travel now? Sarah asked, glancing out the window. The storm had subsided, leaving behind a landscape of pristine white snow. The world outside looked deceptively peaceful, but Sarah knew better. Dr. Elias nodded. The storm's passed, but you'll need to move quickly. There's no telling when the next one will come. Sarah's heart clenched at the thought of stepping back into the cold with Tommy. But they had no choice. She couldn't impose on Dr. Elias forever, and staying in the cabin was only a temporary solution. They needed to find a more permanent place to rebuild their lives. Dr. Elias handed her a small bag filled with supplies. Medicine for Tommy, food, and a map with the safest route back to town. Take this. It'll help you get where you need to go. Sarah looked at him, overwhelmed by his kindness. I don't know how to thank you. You don't need to, Dr. Elias said simply. Just take care of your son. Sarah nodded, her throat tight with emotion. She gently lifted Tommy into her arms, his weight familiar and comforting against her chest. I will, she whispered, as she stepped out into the crisp morning air, the cold biting at her skin. Sarah felt a renewed sense of determination. She would find a way. She had to, for Tommy. And as she began the long walk back through the snow, following the path Dr. Elias had marked for her, she glanced back one last time at the cabin. The doctor stood in the doorway, watching her leave, his face unreadable. Sarah turned her gaze forward, her heart pounding with both fear and hope. The road ahead would be difficult, but she wasn't alone anymore. She had Tommy, and she had the strength of everything they had survived. And that, Sarah knew, would be enough. The journey back to town was a blur of cold and exhaustion. Each step felt heavier than the last, but Sarah pushed forward, her grip on Tommy tight as she followed the path Dr. Elias had marked. The snow crunched beneath her boots, the wind a constant whisper in her ears. But Sarah's focus remained on her son, on the small, steady breaths he took as he slept against her chest. He was warm now, thanks to the doctor's medicine, and his color had returned. It was a fragile hope, but it was enough to keep her going. When she finally saw the outskirts of town through the trees, a wave of relief washed over her. The familiar dilapidated buildings came into view, the same crumbling houses and abandoned streets that had once felt like a prison. But now they felt different. Now, they felt like the beginning of something new, a second chance. As she approached Henry's house, Sarah hesitated. She wasn't sure what she expected to find, whether Henry would be waiting for her or if he would even care that she had returned. But as she reached the front door, she saw him sitting on the porch, his eyes distant as he stared out at the snow-covered landscape. "Henry," Sarah called softly, her voice hoarse from the cold. Henry's head jerked up, and for a moment, he looked at her as though he didn't recognize her. But then his eyes softened, and he stood, his movements slow and stiff. "You made it back." Sarah nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "We made it?" Henry stepped forward, his gaze flickering to Tommy, who was still asleep in Sarah's arms. His expression softened even further, and for a moment, Sarah saw the man he had once been, the father who had loved his daughter with everything he had. "I wasn't sure you would," Henry said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. "But I'm glad you did." Sarah swallowed hard, her throat tight with gratitude. "Thank you, Henry, for everything. You saved us." Henry shook his head, his gaze dropping to the ground. "I didn't save you. You saved yourself." And him, for a moment, they stood in silence, the cold air between them heavy with unspoken words. Finally, Henry cleared his throat and gestured toward the house. "Come inside. You both need to rest." Sarah followed him inside, her heart pounding in her chest. The warmth of the house enveloped her as she stepped through the door, and for the first time, it felt like home. She laid Tommy on the couch, covering him with a blanket before turning to Henry. "Why did you help us?" Sarah asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. "After everything you've been through, why didn't you just turn us away?" Henry hesitated, his eyes shadowed with the weight of his past. "I couldn't save my own daughter," he said quietly, "but I could help you save your son." Sarah felt a lump rise in her throat as she realized the depth of Henry's pain. He had spent so many years locked away in his grief, punishing himself for something that had been beyond his control. But in helping her and Tommy, he had found a small piece of redemption, a way to heal, even if only a little. "You did more than help," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. "You gave us a chance." Henry didn't respond, but his eyes met hers, and in that moment, Sarah saw the truth. He had saved them in more ways than one. The days that followed felt like a slow return to normalcy, though nothing was quite the same. Tommy's strength returned bit by bit, and Sarah's relief was palpable with every step he took, his energy growing each day. Henry's house had become a temporary refuge for them, but it felt less like an imposition and more like a shared space, one of quiet understanding and healing. Winter's grip on the town began to loosen, and with it came the promise of spring. The snow that had once seemed endless now melted in patches, revealing the earth beneath, and with it, a new sense of hope. Sarah found herself walking through the streets of the town, her eyes scanning the empty storefronts, the abandoned homes. There was life here, hidden beneath the decay. It just needed someone to bring it back. One afternoon, while Tommy napped and Henry sat quietly by the fire, Sarah approached him with an idea that had been growing in her mind for days. "Henry," she said, sitting down across from him, "what if we started something here? Something new?" Henry looked up, his eyes narrowing in curiosity. "What do you mean?" "I mean, this town is dying, but it doesn't have to," Sarah continued, her voice gaining strength with every word. "There are people like us, people who need a second chance. We could rebuild, together." Henry stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Sarah held her breath, unsure of how he would respond. She knew Henry had spent so many years closed off from the world, and asking him to open himself up again, to hope, was a lot. But then, slowly, Henry nodded. "Maybe you're right," he said quietly. Maybe it's time to stop living in the past. Sarah's heart soared, a spark of excitement igniting within her. She had come to this town with nothing but a sick child and a desperate hope for survival. And now, standing on the other side of that storm, she saw a future she hadn't thought possible. Over the next few weeks, Sarah and Henry began laying the groundwork for their plan. They cleared out the old, abandoned buildings, talking to the few remaining residents of the town and inviting others to join them. The town, once forgotten and left to wither, began to stir with new life. It wasn't easy. The work was hard and progress was slow, but with each day, the town seemed to breathe a little more deeply. And for Sarah, there was something profoundly healing about building something from the ground up, about creating a future, not just for herself and Tommy, but for Henry and for everyone else who had been left behind. Henry, for his part, had changed too. He still carried the weight of his past, but it no longer defined him. He was present, engaged in the work they were doing, and for the first time in years, Sarah saw him smile. One evening, as the sun set over the town, casting a golden light over the newly repaired rooftops, Sarah sat on the porch with Tommy and Henry, watching the world come alive around them. The air was warm, and the scent of spring filled her lungs. "Look, Mama," Tommy said, pointing to a bird that had landed on the fence nearby. "It's building a nest." Sarah smiled, her heart full. "Yes, it is." Henry sat beside her, his eyes following the bird as it worked tirelessly to create a new home. "It's funny," he said softly, "how life goes on." Sarah nodded, feeling the truth of his words deep in her chest. Life did go on, even after loss, even after hardship. And sometimes, if you were lucky, it gave you a chance to start again. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Sarah looked at Tommy, healthy and strong, and then at Henry, whose eyes, though still haunted by the past, now held a glimmer of peace. Together, they had found something none of them had expected: family. And with that, the town, much like their lives, began to rebuild itself from the ashes. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. It really helps us continue to bring you more captivating stories. We'd love to hear from you. Let us know in the comments what part of the story impacted you the most. Was it the moment of redemption, the struggle for survival, or the bond that formed between the characters? And if you have any story suggestions or ideas for future videos, feel free to share them with us. We're always looking for new, exciting stories to bring to life on the channel. Thanks for being part of this journey, and stay tuned for more.